Arigato gozaimasu. So I'm going to be talking to you guys today about my trip to Japan, where I got to do a rotation in emergency medicine. This is specific to Japan, but I hope that this talk will encourage you guys to go out and explore emergency medicine in the world. Okay, so I chose Japan in medical school because I had been there previously, and I have loved the culture, loved the people, and I wanted to explore more. So at USC, we had an exchange program, essentially, where you could choose to go to one of several different countries in East Asia, specifically. And so I decided to go to Japan because it was something that was completely out of my comfort zone. I didn't speak Japanese at all. I knew that most of the people there could understand English, but they didn't use it a whole lot. So I knew it would be something that would really force me to kind of get out of my shell. As you guys know, I'm like a pretty shy, introverted person. So this was something that I thought would be kind of fun to do and really force me to like become a better clinician, essentially. Okay, so you guys are probably thinking, how can I study abroad? I've already graduated, like, what is this girl talking about? But there's this awesome thing called a sabbatical. So some of you guys may have heard of this. You may think that it's like specific to people who are at academic institutions. But essentially anyone who's working as an attending can take a sabbatical. It just kind of depends on the hospital that you're at, the group that you're with, your own flexibility in making this happen. So what is a sabbatical? Typically it's about a month long. You don't want to do anything shorter than that because you're going to need some time to kind of adjust to your new settings. You don't want to do anything longer than that because typically when you're on a sabbatical, you're not making your full salary. So if you have the money, if you have the time with your group that you're with and the flexibility, then you could potentially do something longer, but you may want to just stick to about a month. It is not just time off. It's typically used as a way to better yourself, to enhance your career. And it's goal-driven with professional objectives. So some of the doctors that I had worked with had taken sabbaticals in the United States, and vice versa. I've seen doctors here who take sabbaticals in international countries. Why should you take a sabbatical? I think that this is probably one of the best ways to avoid burnout. You can learn a new skill. For me, that was learning how to better my physical exam skills, since I couldn't speak to most of my patients and I was just having to rely on what I saw on exam and what I heard. And then it allows you to see medicine in a new light, essentially, because you're experiencing it through the eyes of a whole different culture. Okay, so before you decide to do this, it's important to decide where, obviously. So for me, it was pretty easy to make my decision since I had a limited set of options. You know, as an attending, really, you could go anywhere, essentially. And then there are actually sabbatical programs out there, so I would highly suggest Googling and seeing what you're interested in and what's out there. Of course, you have to discuss this with your employer, but sometimes there might be like grants available, ways to make this a little more affordable for you. And then, of course, you have to make sure that you have your passport and visa up to date. Another thing that I would say is very important is learning about the culture. So before I went to Japan, the first time I knew hardly anything about it. And then the second time, although I knew a lot more, I didn't know really anything about the medical culture. So I actually met with a couple of professors at USC who had graduated from the medical school in Japan that I was going to, and they were able to give me invaluable insight into the culture of medicine there. So When they say resident physician, they truly are residents of the hospital. They typically work 7 days a week. Their shifts are about like 14 hours a day. It's very formal, very hierarchical. You could never round, you know, like how we would go around and we would have like our Starbucks. That was definitely something that you couldn't do. You couldn't snack ever. You couldn't bring your coffee with you. You weren't allowed to wear your scrubs outside of the hospital. If you, for whatever reason, had to leave the hospital at some point during your shift, you had to like wear a big coat over it because you couldn't allow the public to see that you were wearing scrubs. So just a little more formal. And it was invaluable learning about those things before I went. So I didn't make any faux pas. Okay, and then other things that you want to figure out are logistics. So where are you going to stay? I got really lucky because there was housing for students and researchers. If you are going as an attending, I highly recommend speaking to other faculty that are currently there to see if they have like options. Sometimes people will just like rent out a room to you. Okay, so now the fun stuff, talking about my experience. So I stayed in Tokyo, which is like kind of right in the middle of Japan. Japan is obviously a small country, but as you go through the different regions, it's very different in like the types of culture that you'll see. So I stayed in a small neighborhood that was actually very similar to Loma Linda in a lot of respects. It had a very high elderly population, and then it also was the home of one of the major universities in Tokyo, so also had like kind of that college student population. One of the things I really, really loved about Japan, and that I would never have known had I not stayed there, was that it's such a wonderful mix of like modern and ancient culture. So you could go to like the super modern hospital, and then like 100 yards away is this beautiful temple that you would never expect to find. It's just some more pictures of the temple. Okay, so this was the emergency department that I worked in, and emergency medicine in Japan is completely different from emergency medicine here in the United States. So it is entirely run, at this hospital especially, it was entirely run by surgeons actually. So they would do everything from triaging the patients to, you know, taking care of their emergency needs, later performing surgeries on those patients, and then they also did the ICU care. So they were essentially like SICU docs plus surgeons plus emergency medicine docs. And the attendings also work very similar hours. So they typically work like 7 days a week, have like a couple days off a month, pretty rigorous schedule. So that was my attending, and he's actually a neurosurgeon, so he took me to the OR with him several times. He was one of the few docs who spoke English pretty fluently, and that was because he had done a sabbatical here in the United States in Florida. So I thought that was pretty cool. I actually got to do a burr hole for him, so that was pretty exciting. And that's something that here, like as a medical student in the United States, I don't think you'd be allowed to do. So definitely one of the benefits, I think, of going to a foreign country is getting to do things that you may not get to do here because of malpractice. And then these were my residents, and residency there is very different from here. So as an intern, which both of these guys were interns, you don't choose your specialty yet. You essentially rotate through everything, and then you kind of make up your mind about midway through. So they weren't going into surgery, but they had to be like in the emergency department for a month. And the interesting thing was, so in Japan, you learn how to speak English through the first 6 years of school, but a lot of them are very shy, so they don't feel super comfortable speaking English out loud to like, somebody who's a native speaker. So we would sometimes communicate through Google Translate, like we would just type messages to each other. But I think it was a great experience because it helped me kind of adapt and like kind of, become a little more creative with how I communicated with people, and definitely became better at like reading body language and interpreting how people were feeling based on like what I saw as opposed to what I heard. One of the very cool things that they have in Japan that would never work here in the United States, I don't think, is that the doctors actually go out on the ambulances and pick up the patients. So most of the traumas that we saw were level Bs essentially, or B minus, what would have been B minuses, just like essentially ground level falls because of the high elderly population. So we would go to the house, we would pick up the patient and then bring them to the ER. If they had a head bleed, then that same doctor, after picking them up in the ambulance, would perform their brain surgery and then take care of them afterwards. So it's pretty cool continuity of care. Definitely something that I don't think could ever work out here, but it was nice to see a different system. And then there's me wearing my scrubs and then being told that I wasn't allowed to wear scrubs, so I put on the coat real quick. Let's see. And then taking it a step further, the sister hospital to the hospital that I was at actually had a doctor helicopter program. So, had a doctor helicopter program where the doctors actually went out with the helicopter to pick up patients. So essentially kind of like what we do for PICU transport. There's me not actually going out in the helicopter, but pretending. So one thing that I highly encourage if you do go to another country is to learn, like I said, about the culture. So I found that like as a thank you gift, you typically like give bouquets of flowers. So that was one of the things that I did for like all the people that I worked with. I was incredibly grateful for them, like, in feeling their discomfort, but still, trying to talk to me. Like you could tell they were super shy about speaking English, but they did it for my sake. So one of the things that I did was I had a friend in Japan who taught me how to like phonetically give a speech in Japanese. So I didn't really understand what I was saying, but we worked on it together so that I had a speech prepared that essentially conveyed my gratefulness, and I could give it in Japanese, and everyone was super appreciative of that. So I highly recommend if you can like do something extra to just like show how appreciative you are. And then of course there was the incredible food. When you're taking into consideration where you want to go, make sure that it's going to be somewhere that you're going to enjoy, not only for work, because you are going to be there for about a month, and you want to make sure that it's somewhere where you can work hard and play hard. And also take into consideration the time of year. So I specifically wanted to go during cherry blossom season, which is in April. So that was just an added bonus. And do be sure to make connections while you're there. So I met so many wonderful people who I'm still in contact with today. Like we're talking about like the differences in how coronavirus is being handled over there versus here. And it's just been great. One of the residents, the one on the right, is actually a resident in New York now. So he finished his residency in Japan and then he came over here to do another residency essentially. And I put a question slide before I realized we weren't taking questions. But that is the end of my talk. So thank you, everyone.